There was a question in the discussion last time, which was appropriately asked by a philosopher, that leads us straight into tonight's topic. The question was something like this: seeing that Kierkegaard held such terrible views, why should one study him? Now you may think, seeing that tonight's topic is Nietzsche and the crisis in philosophy, that I think that this question is very applicable to Nietzsche. I don't think so particularly. I don't think that his views, for the most part, were so terrible, though a few of them perhaps were. My point is that this question points straight toward the crisis in philosophy. Last week, when I spoke about Kierkegaard and the crisis in religion, I suggested that there were two factors in particular that accounted for the crisis in religion. One of those was a fairly obvious one in the case of religion, namely the emergence of scientific thinking, which has produced great problems for religion. The other factor was a more nearly timeless factor, namely organized religion poses a problem for the genuine religious spirit. I shall try to pursue both of these factors now in relation to philosophy and begin this lecture by talking about the crisis in philosophy before introducing Nietzsche. I do think that the first and chief factor of what I consider the crisis in contemporary philosophy has also been introduced by science. After all, if I understand the question rightly, it does show a considerable regard, which is very widely, if not quite universally, shared in our society, a very profound respect for science. In science, we don't study terrible views. In science, we don't deal with people of whom we think that they are clearly wrong. Philosophers today do, on the whole, want to be scientific. They want to emulate the sciences, not for any cheap motives, not because they want to have the same sort of prestige that scientists have, but for the best of motives. Science has made enormous progress for several centuries now, and incredible progress in the lifetime of most of us, and so one wonders whether philosophy could possibly do better than to imitate science. Now, there is a crisis here. Here I think philosophers are one up on the theologians. It's perhaps one of the few areas where their one-upmanship exceeds that of the theologians, and what the theologians would admit, I think, to be a crisis in philosophy, the philosophers call a revolution in philosophy, and that, in spite of the Un-American Activities Committee, sounds rather good. A revolution in philosophy suggests progress in philosophy, and something that we need not worry about. But there is a crisis in philosophy here. One way, I think, that I can illustrate it is with a story of which I'm not at all sure whether it is true, although I've heard it from many sides. I shall therefore not name the philosopher in question about whom this story is often told. The point is that he is an outstanding logical positivist, and that he supposedly was offered a chair of philosophy at one of our leading universities and did not accept the last minute because supposedly, and this is hard to credit, one of the requirements was that he should, among other things, teach an introductory course on Plato, and he is supposed to have replied, "I will teach only the truth." Now here you have, I think, the same point that I've been dealing with. Why teach terrible views? And Plato did have some views that few of us would accept, even some views in political philosophy that many of us might consider terrible. And here now is the crisis. If a philosopher wants to be scientific, if he does not want to teach things that are not true, if he most certainly does not want to teach things that are terrible, what becomes of practically all the philosophy we have got? What becomes of philosophy from the pre-Socratics and Plato and Aristotle right down to the 20th century? Should it all be rejected? Well, if so, then surely we have reached a crisis in philosophy if philosophers have reached the point where they think that all philosophy so far, or at least most of it, almost all of it, has been one huge mistake. The question immediately arises, of course, if you throw out so very, very much, what is to replace it? The early logical positivists thought that they had a good criterion for telling what could stay and what could not stay. Only that was supposed to stay, only that was recognized as meaningful, which could be verified, and whatever was not verifiable was meaningless, as one supposed in those days, shortly after World War I, and was to be eliminated. And what was left, in fact, was something very different from most of traditional philosophy. Things like philosophy of religion and metaphysics and aesthetics, all that went out the window, and good work was done, important work was done in areas like philosophy of science and logic, especially in those two fields. Friedrich Wittgenstein, who had done as much as any man to inspire logical positivism, drew the really consistent conclusion at that point. After publishing his first book, the so-called Tractatus, in which he thought that he had solved all philosophic problems by showing that most of them were meaningless, he left philosophy. He was a very wonderful man. He had inherited great wealth. He distributed all among the poor and became a village teacher and a gardener's assistant. And then as more and more people accepted his book and his early views, he decided that something must be wrong with them. And so he went back to philosophy, to a second very illustrious career, becoming a professor, though Austrian-born, becoming a professor at the University of Cambridge in England and influencing the second phase of positivism, which is more usually called analytic philosophy, and which today dominates English-speaking philosophy, both in the British Isles, particularly in England, less so in Scotland, and in the United States too. This has been characterized in a little book on English philosophy since 1900 by Geoffrey Warnock, when he says, and what he says here is false, unless we keep in mind that he is talking about English philosophy since 1900. He says, it is at any rate certain that questions of belief, questions of religious, moral, political, or generally cosmic variety, cosmic he puts into smear quotes, are seldom, if at all, directly dealt with in contemporary philosophy. Why is this so? The first part of an answer to this question can easily be given. There's a very large number of questions, not of that variety, which philosophers find themselves more interested in discussing. I think as far as English-speaking philosophy goes, this is a pardonable generalization. There's a great deal of truth in it, even though it isn't literally correct. And if we ask ourselves now, why this shift of interest? It doesn't seem to be true of society generally, that it is no longer interested in questions of religious, moral, political variety. People are quite interested in those. Why aren't philosophers interested in them anymore? I think the answer, the chief answer, answer number one at any rate, is they want to be scientific. They want to obtain agreement on facts. They are embarrassed by disagreement among philosophers, and they despair, sensibly, of obtaining agreement on questions of religious, moral, political, and cosmic variety. So it is the attempt to emulate the sciences that has in one way or another led the vast majority of English-speaking philosophers to abandon the traditional concerns of philosophers and to make a great shift. There are other reasons here which lead me to the second factor, but let me begin by still subsuming them under the attempt to emulate the sciences. One feels that everybody should be able to make some contribution, that the progress in the sciences is made piecemeal by many people doing little things, and so in philosophy too there should be a comparable situation. And then one of the outstanding living English philosophers, Gilbert Ryle, suggests that the analysis of what he calls systematically misleading expressions, and I quote an early essay of his, is what philosophical analysis is, and this is the sole and whole function of philosophy. He is motivated partly, I think, by a desire for something that can be done with precision and accuracy. He is also motivated by the desire of staking out some area in which philosophy will not conflict with science, not be shown up by the progress of science, but on the contrary, where it will be possible for many competent people to make contributions and conceivably even to engage in teamwork of a sort. To mention another equally outstanding British philosopher who died recently, J.L. Austin, he varied the interests of Ryle somewhat by concentrating very largely on things that bordered on lexicography, semantic analysis, analyzing distinctions in ordinary language, hoping that where there are subtle distinctions between words that are apparently synonymous, perhaps some important difference is hidden that might eventually become philosophically important or fruitful, but he found this kind of precise work so absorbing that he very, very rarely indeed bothered to point up its philosophic relevance. The point here is, again, to do something that can be done with precision, to do something that does not involve inspiration but competence, in other words, to emulate the sciences. Now I have said that the other factor, the factor of organization, has also helped to produce the crisis in philosophy, and this, I think, is, if anything, even less obvious than my first point, that science poses a deep and critical problem for philosophy. After all, happily, we don't have organization in philosophy the way we do have it in religion. There's nothing at all unusual for a philosopher going it alone. Of course, there are some little clubs where people get together who happen to agree particularly with each other, but that is the exception rather than the rule. On the whole, philosophy is lucky in not being beset by hierarchies and organizations and all that sort of thing. But in another sense, philosophy has become organized. Let's put the point this way. What I've been saying about philosophy, relinquishing problems of religious and political and cosmic and moral variety so very largely, and becoming so very preoccupied with questions of method, of science, of logic, amounts to saying that philosophy has become, in the 20th century, exceedingly academic. But if we ask why philosophy has become so terribly academic, surely a very important part of the answer is that philosophy has become academic because almost all philosophers are in academies. The organizations in questions are our colleges and universities. We take it for granted that, of course, if a man says, and is in his right mind, that he is a philosopher, that presumably he means that he teaches philosophy at some college or university. But if we think back a few centuries, that of course did not used to be so. People like Descartes and Locke and Hobbes and Berkeley and Hume and Spinoza, they were not professors. They did not have university jobs, and this surely makes a big difference. It does not make all of the difference by itself. We can be more precise here. We can almost be scientific. We can quantify the point. And we can say that the really crucial point about organization is that there formerly, at any one time, in any one generation, there were maybe half a dozen or at most a dozen philosophers. Today there are quite literally many, many thousands. That's no exaggeration. All you have to do is to take some such dictionary as Webster's Collegiate, look up in the back the list of colleges. I think you will find that in the United States alone there are over 1,000 colleges and universities, and most of them have more than one philosopher. Some of them have over a dozen philosophers, which means that in the United States alone you have thousands of philosophers. But this is an entirely new situation which is bound to change the whole tone of philosophy. The unit of publication, for example, can no longer be the book. Nobody has time to read books by thousands and thousands of philosophers. Something new has to be invented to take care of this situation, the scholarly journal. I'm not trying to make fun of this. Perhaps in some way the situation is amusing, but we have here a perfectly reasonable development. There are these thousands of people. They live spread out over a huge country. They can't constantly get together and see each other face to face and talk with each other. How are they going to make each other aware that they are alive physically, that they are alive intellectually, that they have something to say? They have to be scholarly, professional journals in which people write articles of which other people can take note. And these articles, for the most part, are written for what has been called, rightly, fellow craftsmen, fellow technicians, other people who are professionals in the field. Well, if a man like Spinoza had written just for fellow philosophers, there wouldn't have been any need to print his books. He could have circulated them in manuscript, and within 2 years all the fellow philosophers around could easily have read them. This wasn't so just in Spinoza's time, but this was so for a long, long time while philosophy flourished. But these philosophers did not just address this minute audience of maybe 6 or 12 other philosophers, that was all there was in those days, but they addressed the layman too, and so they didn't deal just with academic points, but they dealt with questions that mattered to people generally. Well, today, most professional philosophers lean over backwards not to do that. Take a young man in his 20s who in the 18th century wrote a book with the title Treatise of Human Nature, being an attempt to introduce the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects. His name was David Hume, and the book that he wrote was a great book, which is still studied. But what young professional philosopher in his 20s would dare write a book with a title like that and try to cover so many subjects in a single book? It so happened that Hume's book was initially not a success, but fell stillborn from the presses, as he himself put it. But in time it had an enormous impact. Here then we have the contrast, and we actually find some of the professional philosophers, Warnock, for example, in his little book on English philosophy since 1900, making fun, without naming names, of the amateurs of former ages and extolling the professional philosophers of our time. I feel that the shoe is a little bit on the other foot, and that amateurs like, for example, Hume and Berkeley, who published their major works when they were still in their 20s, are not people for us to look down on. And I dare say that the reason why young philosophers today don't write books like that is not because those books were so amateurish and so bad, but rather because they were so extremely bold. Now, this is a good point, I think, to introduce the philosopher of the evening, and I will do it with a quotation that relates in immediately to what I have characterized as the crisis in philosophy. Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, section 212, which is reprinted or translated in full in the Portable Nietzsche, that traditionally the great philosopher has always stood in opposition to his today. I'm abbreviating the section. The great philosopher traditionally has stood in opposition to his today. Philosophers have been the bad conscience of their time. They knew of a new greatness of man, of a new untrodden way to his enhancement. Confronted with a world of modern ideas, which would banish everybody into a corner and a specialty, a philosopher, if there could be any philosophers today, would be forced to define the greatness of man, the concept of greatness, in terms precisely of man's comprehensiveness and multiplicity, his wholeness and manifoldness. Then Nietzsche gives some illustrations of 16th century philosophers, goes on to talk a little bit about Socrates, and continues, today, conversely, when only the herd animal is honored and dispenses honors in Europe, and when equality of rights could all too easily be converted into an equality in violating rights, by that I mean into a common war on all that is rare, strange, or privileged, on the higher man, the higher soul, the higher duty, the higher responsibility, and on the wealth of creative power and mastery, today, the concept of greatness entails being noble, wanting to be by oneself, being capable of being different, standing alone, and having to live independently. Thus, in 1886, Friedrich Wittgenstein would not only have understood, but I think would have agreed very largely. He too, by temperament, was a man who was different, stood alone, lived independently. But on the whole, certainly ordinary language philosophy, linguistic philosophy, analytic philosophy, whatever we shall call it, is not very much in sympathy with the sentiments expressed by Nietzsche here, but on the contrary, an example of what you might call counter-revolutionary philosophy, not really a revolution in philosophy. Traditionally, the philosopher has been a revolutionary, a heretic, who stood in opposition to his today. But linguistic philosophy has an influence that leads men away from trying to stand alone. It would indeed, as Nietzsche puts it, banish philosophers into a corner and a specialty. It teaches young philosophers not to become heretics, not to become revolutionaries, because it wouldn't be scientific, and they really don't have any special competence that qualifies them for that role. Nietzsche might well have said that it might be a philosopher's business, if there could be any philosophers today, to acquire such a competence. And if you should say, well, it would be terrible if we trained all our young philosophers to become revolutionaries of this sort, this would just bring intellectual chaos, the answer would be that if you decide that nobody should even try things that not everybody can do, surely that would amount to what Nietzsche calls a common war on all that is rare, strange, or privileged, on the higher man, the higher soul, the higher duty, the higher responsibility. Now here we have Nietzsche, another man who is widely considered to be a man with terrible views, even more so than Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard really isn't considered that. It was just I who, out of pure cussedness, brought out that Kierkegaard really had some views that would strike many people as terrible, some of which somehow I take perverse pleasure in. I sort of think that they're thought-provoking, that they make us rethink things that we had taken for granted, that even where I cannot agree with him at all, I learn something from him because he makes me reflect on things that otherwise I might not have reflected on. And Nietzsche, on the other hand, because everybody thinks that he has such terrible views, I sort of swim against the stream here too, by trying to point out that his views really weren't quite so terrible, and what I just read you is a good example. Some people get their hackles up as soon as they hear Nietzsche speaking about the herd animal. This shows his being undemocratic and all that sort of thing. But if you listen once more to the words that I just read you, I wonder whether most of you wouldn't agree that what he characterizes here is precisely some of the most disgraceful things that have happened in our own democracy since World War II, namely that an equality of rights could all too easily be converted into an equality in violating rights, into a common war on all that is rare, strange, or privileged, on the higher man, the higher soul, the higher duty, the higher responsibility, and on the wealth of creative power and mastery. We've had a lot of that since World War II. But let us generalize and not engage at this point in any special pleading for Nietzsche. So let's say, all right, he did have some terrible views, like Kierkegaard and like Plato and like Homer and like Dante and like Dostoevsky, all people who are terribly worth reading and who had perfectly dreadful ideas about all sorts of things. Homer obviously took a great delight in cruelty, thought that it was terribly funny to beat up a hunchback. Dante's sense of humor was even much more gruesome than that. And if it wasn't humor, it's even worse. And in Dostoevsky's case, perhaps some of you are not aware of some of his perfectly dreadful opinions. Here then is the question, is philosophy perhaps in some sense closer to literature than to science? In literature, certainly, we don't consider it necessary for a great writer first to assure us that he has wholesome views. Is philosophy similar to that? Well, perhaps at least partly so. Perhaps there are some similarities between philosophy and poetry, philosophy and literature. Men share what Tolstoy once called a fear to understand things that clash with their own customs, privileges, or beliefs. I think we all share that fear. Some of us are a little more housebroken than others. Some of us have mastered this fear to some extent. Some of us perhaps are never conscious of this fear, but still, I think all of us find, if we are very honest with ourselves, that on occasion we don't try very hard to understand things that clash with our own customs, privileges, or beliefs. And just as it is one of the functions of literature to force us to enter into ideas, views that clash with our customs, privileges, and beliefs, so philosophers too might have this job, among others, to make men more sensitive to other points of view, to show men how an outlook that's widely slandered and despised looks and feels from inside. To that extent, a philosopher, I think, is closer to an artist, and particularly a novelist or a dramatist, than he is to a scientist. Now, there are differences, however. A novelist or a dramatist may occasionally examine an argument. He really doesn't have to. A philosopher constantly has to evaluate the arguments for and against alternative positions. And this can be quite thrilling. This can be quite interesting to do this. This is an important part of philosophy. The point that I'm making is not particularly original or revolutionary in our time. It was made long ago by Socrates in that perhaps most famous saying of his, that the unexamined life is not worth living. It's part of the function of a philosopher to lead people to examine their lives. And one way of doing that is by being provocative, by provoking people, by offering them terrible views to make them think. Wittgenstein has put this point beautifully, if only in a posthumously published letter to a younger friend and student. I quote it. "What is the use of studying philosophy if all that it does for you is to enable you to talk with some plausibility about some abstruse questions of logic, etc., and if it does not improve your thinking about the important questions of everyday life, if it does not make you more conscientious?" I know that it's difficult to think well about certainty, probability, perception, etc., but it is, if possible, still more difficult to think or try to think really honestly about your life and other people's lives. And the trouble is that thinking about these things is often downright nasty. And when it's nasty, then it's most important. I find this a terribly moving letter. I think Wittgenstein himself, on this particular point, didn't practice what he preached. I think Nietzsche did practice what Wittgenstein here preached. He was nasty enough, I think, to suit any of you, but nasty not just for the sake of being nasty, but nasty because he tried to think really honestly about his own life and other people's lives. Nietzsche himself put the same point a number of times. One of his briefest formulations is that he said it was a very trite idea to have the courage of one's convictions. What really mattered was to have the courage for an attack on one's convictions, which is another way of saying, in his somewhat more aggressive manner, the courage to examine one's convictions, the courage to re-examine one's convictions, the courage to ask whether there isn't something wrong with them. We find the same thing beautifully expressed in a letter to a sister right at the beginning of the portable Nietzsche, where he says, "Here the ways of men part. If you want peace of mind, then believe, and if you want to have the truth, then inquire," and where he pictures how difficult a way of life it may be if you inquire, how often you are bound to be unsure, how often your conscience is apt to bother you, how often you may live in what Kierkegaard might have called fear and trembling. I think what makes Nietzsche particularly remarkable is that he is a rare embodiment of what I consider the philosophic, the Socratic philosophic spirit. There may be some things about his personality that are not so attractive. In this respect, I think he is thoroughly admirable. In his uninhibited passion for truth and in his rarely equaled craving for intellectual integrity. These are rare qualities. They are not often encountered. I'll be terribly brief about his life and about his personality. Some of the major points may be very well known to most of you, and so there's no need to dwell on them. One thing that's mildly interesting is that Nietzsche's father was born the same year as Kierkegaard in 1813. I just mention it because it indicates that Nietzsche is really one generation later. He didn't read Kierkegaard. Georg Brandes, who was the first to discover Nietzsche and one of the first to discover Kierkegaard and also helped to discover such people as Ibsen and as Strindberg, called Nietzsche's attention to Kierkegaard in a letter just at the end of Nietzsche's life, and Nietzsche didn't get around anymore to procuring any of Kierkegaard's works. Nietzsche himself was born in 1844 and died in 1900. His father died when he was a little boy. He was brought up by his mother together with his sister and also with the benefit of a grandmother and two maiden aunts. Eventually escaped to the university where he studied classical philology, and at the very young age of not yet 25 became a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, Switzerland. The greatest experience of his Basel period, of his period as a professor, was his temporary friendship with Richard Wagner, also, if I remember right, born in 1813, also of the generation of Nietzsche's father, a very asymmetrical friendship in which Wagner appreciated the young intellectual who was his errand boy, bought Christmas presents for the family, could be persuaded to append to his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, a long, very purple prosy eulogy of Richard Wagner, and that was appreciated by Wagner at a time when Wagner was not much appreciated. But sooner or later, this relationship had to come to an end, even if the particular things that did happen hadn't happened, because Wagner had no interest in Nietzsche's striving for intellectual independence, had no sympathy at all for Nietzsche's particularly personal aspirations, so that Nietzsche could either give those up permanently and just become a publicity man for Wagner, or had to break with Wagner. He did the latter. It happened after Wagner went to Bayreuth and established there a great center of Wagnerism, also of anti-Semitism and Francophobia and all sorts of political ideas that Nietzsche didn't like. The capstone, as many of you know, was when Wagner wrote Parsifal, which Nietzsche thought was a very unpleasant affair, because he did not for a moment think that Wagner really now had faith, but felt that the old atheist who had prided himself on his atheism and called himself Schopenhauer's first disciple, and also a modern Aeschylus, that this man now was using Christianity and the idea of the pure fool, a very un-Greek idea, for theatrical effect. So they broke. Nietzsche, shortly after, also resigned from the university and then lived for another 10 years in relative poverty in Switzerland and Italy most of the time, Switzerland in the summers, Italy in the winters, and his heroism, which I think was very real, was very different from those from those terribly theatrical busts and drawings that you have seen with the huge moustaches that were commissioned by the sister after he had become insane and was an imbecile and could not protest. His heroism consisted in the fact that his health was terrible, that the doctors kept advising him to take it easy, to take care of his eyes, not to read so much, not to write so much, and that he burnt himself out, publishing not like Kierkegaard so many books a year, but quite steadily one book a year, and put everything into that until there was nothing left of him anymore, and he became insane. The insanity, according to most of the people who have studied it posthumously, was probably a general paralysis, in which case there must presumably have been a syphilitic infection. Those who have studied the matter dispassionately have charged that Nietzsche may, as a student, once or twice have visited a brothel. This is not well attested, but it certainly is very possible. It's also possible, not that it greatly matters to me, I don't see why it should matter to you, that when he was a medical orderly during the Franco-Prussian War, he might have become infected as he was taking care of sick soldiers. What does matter, what is relevant, is whether Nietzsche's works can be shrugged off as the writings of a madman, and this is a popular idea with people who don't know much psychology, with amateur psychologists, but perhaps it's interesting to hear what Freud thought of Nietzsche. Freud said of Nietzsche that he had, and I quote, a more penetrating knowledge of himself than any other man who ever lived or was ever likely to live. Rather a handsome compliment. I think I'm not at all sure that it's true, but I find it quite stunning anyway, that he had a more penetrating knowledge of himself than any other man who ever lived or was ever likely to live. That presumably includes Sigmund Freud himself. He also said of Nietzsche that his insights often agree in the most amazing manner with the laborious results of psychoanalysis, and that although in his later years Freud didn't have any particular enthusiasm for Nietzsche, whose whole temperament was very different from his own in many respects. There's no need, I think, to go over a list here of Nietzsche's books. They're usually divided into three periods. First, things like The Birth of Tragedy and The Untimely Meditations, essays, then as aphoristic works, the ones that really are aphoristic, that consist of lots of short sections strung together, and then in his final period, first Thus Spoke Zarathustra, then Beyond Good and Evil, Genealogy of Morals, and then finally, in his last conscious year, 1888, he equaled Kierkegaard by writing in 1 year The Case of Wagner, The Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Ecce Homo, and composing out of things written earlier, Nietzsche contra Wagner. Now, there is an enormous amount to be said about Nietzsche's philosophy, which I shall not say tonight, and perhaps this is a good moment to give you briefly some bibliographical suggestions for Nietzsche and for this whole series of 3 lectures. If you are willing to look at 2 books, assuming that you haven't already read one or both, the 2 that I would advise, both in connection with Nietzsche and with this whole section of 3, and in terms of which I think you would get much more out of the whole series than if you just listen to the lectures, are Existentialism from Dostoevsky to Sartre, mainly for texts by the men themselves, and my From Shakespeare to Existentialism for interpretations of the men, including Nietzsche. For Kierkegaard, if you want to do some additional reading, I would say the work of his to read is Fear and Trembling, the work about him to read, which also is available, like everything I am mentioning, in paperback, Walter Lowry's Short Life of Kierkegaard, which is enormously sympathetic and I think illuminating. That's a paperback by the Princeton University Press. The others are respectively Anchor and Meridian. For Nietzsche, for the texts, the portable Nietzsche, there are some important works that are in the Modern Library Giant Nietzsche and not in the portable, and vice versa for that matter. I do think that some of the translations in the Modern Library Giant are travesties. For an interpretation of Nietzsche that covers points that I shall not bring up tonight, there's my own little Meridian book on Nietzsche. And for Sartre, whom I want to discuss next week, if you want to read one thing by him, in addition to the things in Existentialism from Dostoevsky to Sartre, I'd suggest No Exit and 3 other plays, and preferably of those, No Exit and The Flies. And if you're willing to tackle a big university press book, that is a very good secondary text on French existentialism, Hazel Barnes, The Literature of Possibility. Now, to speak briefly about Nietzsche's philosophy, I will first mention two major misconceptions of Nietzsche. One of them, Nietzsche as a Nazi, a view that used to be popular in this country during World War II, that also was popular in Germany just preceding World War II, although I think not quite as popular really in Germany as here, because more people in Germany knew their Nietzsche, had read them, and knew how many things there were in Nietzsche that didn't square with Nazism. And I dare say that this view is quite universally abandoned by Nietzsche scholars. I don't think that on this I wouldn't be afraid to say so if I stood alone on this and if I thought I was right against the world, but that is not the situation. In fact, I think that Nietzsche scholars are pretty well agreed that this is a very serious misreading of Nietzsche, that Nietzsche, to give a couple of examples, did not say, my ideal is Cesare Borgia, but he said that he liked even Cesare Borgia better than Parzival, and that wasn't saying very much coming from Nietzsche. Or when he spoke of the blonde beast, which he did, I think, all of 3 times, he had in mind by the blonde beast a lion, and was referring to the brute health and strength of the Teutonic races before they became Christianized. He did think there was something nice about a lion, but if you want to know what he really seriously as a philosopher thought of the blonde beast and of the lion, you need read no further than the first chapter. I mean the first chapter now and not the prologue of Zarathustra, where you get the image of the lion as not the highest thing. There are 3 transformations or metamorphoses, and the first one is the camel, the beast of burden that humbly accepts tradition, then the lion, the beast, the revolutionary that throws it off, and finally the creative child. And so for Nietzsche, quite generally, there's not high-handed exegesis, but quite generally, the blonde beast was very far from being his ideal. And so one could run through various other slogans that have been misinterpreted. I won't do it now. In the chapter on how Nietzsche revolutionized morals from Shakespeare to existentialism, you will find a very brief treatment, one after the other, of these major misconceptions. The only other one that I do want to mention is that among those who have given up any notion that Nietzsche was a Nazi are those who have developed about him what you might call the incoherence theory, namely that he was completely incoherent and that he said absolutely anything on any subject that just happened to come to his mind. In a kind of rarefied or sublimated way, this theory is championed by Karl Jaspers, who sees Nietzsche in some such way and sees great glory in this. He thinks this is a wonderful thing because whatever position you may adopt, Nietzsche sort of shocks you out of it by saying something else, and so you are, in Jaspers' words, set whirling. Now, if one reads Nietzsche the way Karl Jaspers reads him, which is by way of file cards that you write down juicy quotations, and then you sort of look now at this and now at that, you can be set whirling, that's very true, but you can do something like that, not quite so easily, but quite a number of writers. In fact, with all writers of very great scope, perhaps. Certainly you could do it with Plato, for example. I think that Nietzsche isn't as incoherent as all that, but there is in Nietzsche a coherent doctrine. The other existentialists agree on that. Heidegger finds a coherent doctrine in him, albeit one that I don't find in him. Sartre and Camus, I think, find some coherence in him, so do any number of people. Now, I should briefly mention some of these doctrines at least, and I will dwell relatively longest, I'll be brief on all of these points, on Nietzsche's psychology. This relates him, as most of the things that I am stressing do, even if I don't keep emphasizing it in every sentence, this relates him to existentialism. What the existentialists have in common is their concern with human nature, with human existence. Now, psychology has been a traditional concern of philosophers. Plato was interested in psychology, Aristotle was, Spinoza was in a big way, Hume was, as I mentioned before. But in Nietzsche there are several innovations. The first one is that he quite deliberately puts his conception of man, both of man as he is and of man as he might be, quite emphatically in the center of his thought, and coins a word for his idea of man as he might be. The word in German is Übermensch. In English this has sometimes been translated in a word that has become debased currency, Superman. It's better, I think, for a variety of reasons to use the word Overman for it. Moreover, still much more interesting, Nietzsche, in considering the views of others, in his literary criticism, in his criticism of religion, and in his criticism of philosophers, looks for their visions of man, looks for the visions of man that they presuppose, perhaps unconsciously, explicates these hidden visions of man in other people's philosophies, and then criticizes them. And he bases his psychology on a much broader empirical fundament than I think any philosopher before him, which is what earned him Freud's compliments. His own major psychological concepts have been, I think, insufficiently studied and contrasted with those of Freud and Freud's successors. The chief ones are, first of all, the conception of the will to power. The will to power, as understood by Nietzsche, is by no means just the vulgar sort of striving for power, which finds expression in militarism and imperialism. Nietzsche was as sharp a critic of the Bismarck Empire as that empire produced. He had no admiration for that sort of thing at all, but descriptively found in that too, of course, an expression of a will to power, but he also found the will to power everywhere else. He found it in Christianity in a peculiar form. He thought, and he could quote St. Thomas Aquinas and any number of other great saints along these lines, that the Christian, having despaired of this world, hopes to go to heaven, and then from heaven behold the torments of his masters, of his enemies in hell. He too wants power, but having despaired of power in this world, seeks power in another world. The artist too seeks power. The philosopher too seeks power. We have here as comprehensive a monistic theory as we find in the early Freud, and a theory that might well be weighed in the balance against the dualism of the older Freud. Just as when Freud tried to supposedly explain everything in terms of sex, this meant that in fact he reinterpreted the traditional idea of sex, that what he finally meant by the sex impulse was something much less crude than what some other people had meant. So what Nietzsche means when he speaks of the will to power is also something just a little more subtle, something a little more polymorphic, something a little more protean, and just as Freud could hardly be said by an intelligent person to have endorsed or celebrated the sex impulse, so it is stupid, I think, to say of Nietzsche that he endorsed or celebrated the will to power. Another conception, psychological conception of Nietzsche's, which bears out what I've just said about the will to power, is the conception of sublimation. It was Nietzsche who first used that word sublimation in its contemporary sense, and his whole conception of the will to power, his whole psychology of the will to power depends on this idea of substitutions, that people again and again settle for what is second best, that when they can't get what they most want, then they will settle for brute power, for physical power, for cruelty, which isn't what they really want, but what is in modern terminology to be explained in terms of frustration. Nietzsche's key word here is the word resentment, and he finds resentment central in Christianity and finds resentment central in a great deal of traditional morality. And he initiates something for which Karl Jaspers coined a nice title in one of his early books, namely Psychology of Weltanschauungen, to look at Weltanschauungen and understand the psychological bases of them. Now, what I might do, but definitely shall not do, at least in the lecture part, if you want to bring it out in discussion, all right, is deal specifically with Nietzsche on religion, to tie it up with last week's lecture, and with Nietzsche on morality, to tie it up with next week's lecture. The reason I will not do this is because I see no point in repeating in a lecture what I have written and published. So for those particularly interested in Nietzsche on religion, I may mention the chapter on Nietzsche's repudiation of Christ in my little book on Nietzsche. For those interested in Nietzsche and morality, the chapter already mentioned on how Nietzsche revolutionized morals in From Shakespeare to Existentialism. What I still want to say about Nietzsche's philosophy is that perhaps one can illuminate it by suggesting that there are three different types of philosophy encountered in Nietzsche. First of all, the traditional kind of philosophy, which I think in understanding Nietzsche is least important, though Heidegger, very perversely to my mind, stresses this and only this in his essay on Nietzsche, in his essay, not translated into English, on Nietzsche's word, God is Dead. And this is the metaphysician in Nietzsche. He thinks that Heidegger thinks that Nietzsche was the last great metaphysician of the West. Plato, perhaps the first, and Nietzsche the last. Well, there is some metaphysics in Nietzsche. The will to power does become, in the late Nietzsche, also, among other things, on top of everything else, a metaphysical hypothesis. He has to out Schopenhauer and say, Schopenhauer thought the ultimate reality was the will to live. No, it isn't that, it is the will to power. But I think this is a wholly marginal part of Nietzsche's philosophy. The two parts in Nietzsche's philosophy that are strong are one, the analytic, and two, the existential. And this is what I have in mind when I think of Nietzsche as not himself a clear-cut existentialist, but as sort of the Walter said, the last great world historical philosopher in whom these two timeless tendencies are still very well fused. Well, in our time, there has been a dissociation of sensibility, and we have the analyst speaking English and the existentialist speaking German and French. Let me illustrate the analytic element in Nietzsche very briefly, and I will stress here particularly things that have to do with emphasis on language and grammar to link him with what's going on in analytic philosophy today. You find, for example, as analytic philosophy, his analyses of God, of the true world, of morality, of the good, of the four great errors, all in the twilight of the idols contained in the portable Nietzsche. You find them saying such things as, language talks of opposites, but there are only degrees and many refinements of gradation. He speaks of the misleading errors of language and the fundamental fallacies of reason which have become petrified in language, which understands and misunderstands all activity as due to an agent, a subject. Again, he says that when there is thinking, something must exist that does think is simply a formulation of our grammatical habits which couple all doing with a doer. There's plenty of this sort of thing in Nietzsche, which you might call anti-metaphysical and positivistic. But there is, of course, in Nietzsche also a great deal that links him with existentialism, and I'll just enumerate. His literary criticism, something in which Heidegger, Sartre, and Camus have also engaged in a big way. His psychological interests, his critique of Christianity and of Weltanschauungen generally, his analysis of nihilism and of different possible attitudes toward an absurd world. particularly relevant to the sort of thing that Sartre and Camus have done, his celebration that I've read to you of a new greatness of man and his attempt to cross over from philosophy into literary attempts. It is therefore not surprising that Karl Jaspers should have written 2 books about Nietzsche, that Heidegger should have written an important essay about him, that Nietzsche's name should be the first name mentioned in Sartre's Being and Nothingness, and that Camus has written at length about him too. They're interested in him, they realize that in some sense he is one of theirs. It's high time for a conclusion, so that there will be time for some discussion. I've said that a philosopher probably should stand somewhere between literature, poetry on the one hand, and science on the other. And I think if one wants to criticize Nietzsche, one may well say that although this makes him readable and appealing and interesting, he stands a little too far in the direction of out-and-out literature, that there is too little in him of careful summing up, of taking together the different things he has said and himself comparing them instead of just leaving it to somebody else to do this, and seeing what stands up, what doesn't stand up, what has to be qualified. There is too little of that. There are many other criticisms that one can make of Nietzsche, just as in the case of Kierkegaard and of Sartre next week. I don't want to press all of these. One might just pick out one so that you see in what direction I might proceed. I think that occasionally he makes much too sharp a dichotomy between the higher man, the superior person, and the rest of mankind. But one would also have to say that if you read him thoroughly, you find him in other places trying to balance this. The whole 4th part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, for instance, makes fun of the higher man and makes the point quite literally that the higher men stink. I want to end on a positive note, and I will say in conclusion that for all his faults, I think there are exceedingly few philosophers or writers who equal Nietzsche in a fusion of 3 things: of scope, of which he has far more than almost any other philosopher. There's scarcely anything that might interest you intensely that he doesn't deal with. This in itself is no accomplishment. It might all be superficial for all that. So we have to take with this the second point he fuses with it, depth. Whatever he deals with, I think he goes, if not to the bottom of it, he goes very deep. He is very profound. He makes us see things we didn't see before. And then together with the scope and depth, which for all that might be tedious, might be a bore, except for people with a very strong intellectual stomach, he has also a great deal of passion, which makes him contagious, which is a good thing, which makes him inspire other people to be interested and to care strongly. And if you take him all in all, I do think, on reflection, the more I think about him, that he was one of the greatest philosophers and writers of all time. There are very few other philosophers that one can come back to again and again and read for pleasure.